One of the things in terms of introductions for myself and our culture, it is traditional that we introduce ourselves from our lineage further. I belong to we're a matrilinear society, so our mothers take precedence over our father's side. So I'm born for the one who walks around clan on my mom's side, born for the Zuni people. My maternal grandparents are from the Black Sheep people. And my paternal side is also from the Zuni people as well. So in terms of lineage, I wanted to say that in addition to the introduction that has already been given. First, before I do my presentation, I do want to acknowledge the original people of this land. It is customary for indigenous people to honor those indigenous people that are come from the territories for which we are presenting. And so I want to honor the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Mosapela, the Shawnee, and the Yuchi people of the original territories of this land. So I'm just going to cover a real basic framework of intergenerational trauma, and I don't need to go through these points. I want to really get back into the context of the presentation, but I do want to give an overview of the intergenerational trauma and what it means to Native people. I use Native people, Indians, American Indian, Alaskan Natives, all in the context of meaning the same people, original to the North Americas. Talk a little bit about what the effects of intergenerational trauma has happened to our peoples. Talk a little bit about epigenetics and what some of the findings are saying and where that leads us to. Talk a little bit about some considerations from healing from our worldview. And so as you get out there and you work with indigenous people, that you take that into context when you're providing your services. And then some additional considerations for those in the therapeutic area. What is generational trauma? Michelle Sortillo of the University of Nevada offers a three-part definition that I think helps to explain what intergenerational trauma is. In the initial phase, the dominant culture perpetuates mass trauma on a population in the form of colonialism, slavery, war, and genocide. And I'll get into a little bit of that as we go through the presentation. The second phase, the effects on that population include physical and psychological symptoms in response to that trauma. Third, the initial population passes these traumas on to the next subsequent generations, who in turn display the similar symptoms. One of the things I also wanted to mention, there's a lot of confusion around intergenerational trauma and historical trauma. So I thought it'd be worth mentioning what historical trauma is. According to Braveheart, it is a collective complex trauma inflicted on a group of people. Historical trauma can be historical unresolved grief that has not been sufficiently acknowledged, expressed, or otherwise addressed. The disenfranchised grief when loss cannot be voiced publicly, that is not publicly acknowledged, is a lack of recognition of loss of American Indians from colonialism, disease, and the corresponding lack of recognition of their right to grieve these collective experiences. This results in internalized oppression. When traumatized Native American people internalize the views of the oppressor and perpetuate cycles of self-hatred, manifesting in negative behaviors in their own lineage. I want to talk a little bit more about boarding schools. There's a speech that was given by the cavalry captain, Richard Henry Pratt, who said, "Kill the Indian and save the man." For Colonel Richard Henry Pratt, the goal was to completely assimilate Native people into the white culture. In 1879, he established the Carlisle Indian School, which is located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Pratt believed that the off-reservation school established in white communities could help accomplish his mission. Within the boarding schools, children were forbidden to speak their native language, practice their native traditions, or convey anything that looked native. In addition, children were starved, chained, and abused. Naturally, Native parents resisted these schools. Sometimes entire villages refused to enroll their children in white men's schools. In the case of the Hopi in Arizona in 1894, men, the parents of Hopi children, were arrested, placed on a train from Arizona, and sent to California and placed in maximum security at Alcatraz. Their crime? Rebelling against plans to send their children to assimilation boarding schools, hundreds of miles away from the reservation. It was not until 1978, 41 years later, with the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act, that Native American parents gained the legal right to deny their children's placement in off-reservation schools. Next slide. There are so many facets of history, policy making that impact Native Americans, and I tried to condense it for the purpose of this presentation in different phases that have happened. And so Duran Duran offers some good insights in regard to that. The historical legacy of Native Americans is built on legal and political relationships by the United States government, as suggested by Delore in 1983. When the U.S. won independence from Great Britain, that first treaty was signed by the U.S. government and the Lenape Delaware tribe in 1778. Over the next century, between 1978 and 1871, 600 similar treaties were created, and the majority broken due to the name of expansion. In two court decisions in 1902 and 1903, the U.S. Supreme Court held that Congress had the power to modify or terminate Native American treaties without Native Americans' consent. By not honoring these treaties, it left Native American people across this country feelings of mistrust, economical and social disadvantages by their displacement and frequent relocations. In order to provide context to the chaotic and painful set of events imposed on Native Americans in this country, I offer these 6 phases of historical trauma. The first is first contact, in such where Native Americans were destroyed through genocidal military actions. This did not allow people to grieve for the losses, or more traumatic events continued to occur. The actions included the U.S. military issuing blankets laced with smallpox, resulting in thousands of deaths of Native people across this country. The second, economic competition. In this phase, Native Americans suffered the loss of subsistence, both physically and spiritually. For example, my Navajo people, the Dine, were impacted by the government's scorched earth policy and tactics. In order to get them to surrender and to be placed at Fort Sumner, known as Huete, a land of suffering to our Navajo people in New Mexico, this event has impacted me personally. As my great-grandmother, Bishti Bob, she joined the warriors was her traditional name, was born at Huete. She was born in 1867. Her family were considered prisoners and wards of the government. At the age of 2 years old, and her family members arrived back in what is known as Southern Arizona. So the story goes, it took her and her family and other relatives approximately 2 years to walk back from Fort Sumner to Southern Arizona. The third phase, invasion of war, was a time when Native people throughout the United States were forced to live in the confines of reservations. No longer were they allowed to roam, hunt, gather, as their ancestors did before them. The fourth, boarding school. In this era, the U.S. government carried out policies of extermination through military force. Native people suffered from refuge syndrome, which we still do today. And fifth, the reservation period, along with forces of relocation to reservations. In the 1950s, young Native people were sent to the urban areas in order to assimilate them into mainstream society. Native people's experience racism were viewed as second class, loss of governmental systems and communities. What are the effects of intergenerational trauma? As I have taken you a little bit through some of the historical events that have happened, it's so multidimensional and there's so many facets to it. It leads to and continues to, as a Native American, it leads to the high rates of mental and physical illness. And here are some of the statistics. Native Americans experience serious psychological distress more than 1.5 times more than the general public. Native Americans experience PTSD more than twice as often as the general population. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in ages 10 to 34 years old. American Indians and Native Alaskans continue to die at high rates due to chronic liver disease, cirrhosis, diabetes, unintentional injuries, assaults and homicides, intentional self-harm, suicide, and chronic lower respiratory diseases. Use of substances. American Indians and Alaskan Natives ages 12 and over had the highest rate of substance abuse and dependence in 2017 at a rate of 12.8%. Let me just remind you that alcohol was a commodity of trade in this country initially. In addition, alcohol was used as a tool of diplomacy in official dealings with the US government and Native people, involving into a de facto policy. A little bit on violence. As you all are aware, right now in this country, we're talking about murdered and missing Indigenous women across this country. And here are some of those statistics to validate that. More than 4 out of 5, which is about 83.3% of American Indian and Alaskan Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. More than half of the American Indian and Alaskan Native women have experienced sexual violence with their own intimate partners. Native American also face murder rates more than 10 times the national average in this country. Domestic violence, physical and sexual assault are 3.5 times higher than the national average in Native American communities. And lastly, the erosion of families. Due to the boarding school eras, family systems have been destroyed. Parents went to boarding schools, did not know how to parent. So when they had children of their own, they were unable to parent them and nurture them. There are changes in traditional ways of bearing and caring for children, including the family structures and relationships. For example, I'll take my own Dine culture. In my Dine culture, there are 4 aspects to the body. There's the mental, the physical, the intellectual, and the spiritual. A man's role in our society is that the men are responsible for the spiritual and the emotional aspects of a family, and the women are responsible for the physical and the intellectual aspects of a family. That gives you some idea of how far we've gone away from what we were taught, as an example. Bottom line is that all of this causes confusion for Native people in terms of who they are and who they identify themselves with. Some other effects include child abuse and neglect, PTSD. I've already mentioned that it destroys communities, and it also threatens Native cultures and languages. What are some of the obvious changes that I see in my Native American communities? Traditional Native gender roles and relationships are impaired by women and children. We're not necessarily the property of the male. Most Native American cultures are matrilinear. And so I think that's one point to take away anything that's important to know. The sacredness of children was lost due to the abuse, primarily sexual abuse. Native men have lost their traditional parenting roles as warriors and protectors. Native parents who have been assimilated have been instilled in them that their cultures are inferior, and they raise their children without traditional values or culture, ultimately impacting the culture itself. Native cultures are primarily orally communicated. All of our stories, our prayers, our chants are all oral. Much of this has been lost, and what remains is still cherished by the Native people of this country. Talk a little bit about what is epigenetics for those that are new to this field. It basically means above or on top of the genetics. It refers to external modifications in the DNA that turns certain aspects of our genes off and on. These modifications do not change the DNA sequence, but instead they affect how the cell reads the genes. Some of the research that has been done recently include genetics suggests that our genes can carry memories of trauma experienced by our ancestors and can influence how we react to trauma and stress. Second, trauma experienced by our ancestors can influence the structure of our genes, making them more likely to turn on negative responses to stress and trauma. In 1998, the Adversity Childhood Experience Study done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente showed that adverse childhood experiences could contribute to mental and physical illness. Researchers have found that high rates of ACE in Native American people and lead to health problems such as PTSD, depression, substance abuse, diabetes, are all linked to the methylation of genes regulating the body's response to stress. According to Mr. Bitsui, a Navajo geneticist at Harvard, he indicates that genetics is beginning to uncover scientific proof that intergenerational trauma is real and can contribute to the causes of illnesses such as PTSD, depression, and type 2 diabetes. Even though that we've gone through all these historical events that have caused a great deal of trauma in our lives, Native people are very resilient. And this is one of those aspects that I think that epigenetics can offer. It can offer insight on the inherent resilience of the Native and Indigenous people. So I think that's one thing, if you're a researcher, that you might put that little seed in place for you. Next, on the considerations of healing. As practitioners and individuals working with Native individuals and communities, there are some points worth considering. First of all, Native people consider all beings sacred. That includes this table, my glasses, water. Everything is sacred. In Western thought, we have a tendency to break things and subjects into separate disciplines: psychology, medicine, mathematics. In a Native sense of the world, there is no separation. Number two, Native people have belief in unseen powers that take the form of deities that are sacred. These deities are part of the ceremonial and medicine people have the ability to communicate with higher sources and these beings. Number three, Native people have a belief in the interconnectedness of all things, the belief that all things in the universe are dependent on one another. For example, if one takes the life in an animal for food, that you take the time to explain to the animal why you're taking their life. That takes responsibility for that act and that action. Number four, there's an important link between individual worship and community well-being and vice versa. Each individual's prayer reinforces the bond between the human being and the Great Spirit, God, Creator. This can be achieved through purification ceremonies, blessing way ceremonies, and individual sacrifices. 5, the goal to happiness in one's life is balance and harmony among the elements and the forces of nature. It is the belief that if we take care and understand and learn the ecological relationships, this also helps to establish ethical behavior to survive in the natural world. Lastly, it is a common belief that humor is necessary of the sacred, and belief that human beings are weak. We make mistakes. If we are too serious or we take things, we feel like we have too much power, it causes imbalance in us from a spiritual, physical, mental, and psychological standpoint. Some considerations as therapists working in this field for you to think about as well is number one, trust is key. When you look at all of the historical events that happened to Native people across this country, mistreatment and distrust, there is no wonder that this is important. It will take time and allow for that. Number two, educate yourself about the tribe. It is important to understand that most tribes are matrilinear and some are paternal, so that you need to understand that for the basis of who they are as people. What are their traditional ceremonies? Learn a few words like hello, so that when your client or you're working in the community, that shows that you're working towards that. Number three, it is vital that the therapeutic approach that you choose is culturally based, or that it incorporates aspects of that culture. Lastly, because most tribes receive health care under the Indian Health Service, and the interventions that are used are those supported by mainstream medical research, keep in mind that if the research does not include Native Americans, that the therapeutic approach may not work in real life. That is so key. In summary, from a Native American perspective, intergenerational trauma is real. I have seen the effects of captivity, forced removal, alcoholism, PTSD in my own family lineages. And therefore, there's a link between my ancestors' generation and future generations. In order for therapeutic approaches to be effective, they must be culturally appropriate intervention strategies. As Native people, we see culture as medicine, meaning that our culture has both a protective and a therapeutic value. Time, history, and adversity have fostered inherent traits and beliefs that have created strong and resilient Native American communities. Let's not forget about the value of community. In addition, tribal language and beliefs ensure each tribe's worldview is passed on to the next generation. Healing will take generations. We need to build on the healing that has begun. We are the ancestors of the next 7 generations. Thank you. Okay.